Hello, and I'm going to be starting a set of video tutorials on my favorite subject, property law. So to begin with, I want to introduce the concept of property, and I want to do this by discussing two different pieces. One is Cohen's dialogue on private property, and one is a work put forward by the geographer Nicholas Blomley. So I'm going to divide this video into two. The first one's purely going to talk about Cohen and his dialogue on private property, and then you'll find part two, which is on Blomley and further issues regarding property, and these two videos should provide you with the introduction to the subject. So Cohen was talking about private property and looking for a definition of private property in 1954. Now, I want to begin this video by giving you his end premise, what he basically concludes on, because then all the things we will look at, which he discussed, will make much more sense. So, word for word now, I'll read out what is the conclusion he comes to in his dialogue on private property. He comes to the understanding that I'll read it now. That is property to which the following label can be attached. To the world. Keep off X unless you have my permission, which I may grant or withhold. Signed, private citizen, endorsed the state. So I think it's very easy to understand what that means, but at the end we'll go back to it because we'll see how does he come to that premise. So what are the crucial points in his dialogue? Well, he begins his whole argument. It's always important to see where he starts from. And he starts by looking at, does private property even exist, or is it a construct of the mind? And he comes to a conclusion that it does exist. But he differs from Blackstone or Hegel, who say that private property is basically a man's control over a physical object or a thing, because he starts off his dialogue by saying private property can be a physical thing, it can be a book, it can be a pen, which is my property, but it also can be intangible. So he was talking about intellectual property, copyright to a song, patents or pharmaceuticals, things like that. It can be intangible as well. It doesn't have to be man's control of an external physical thing. And thirdly, he says it's to do with social relations, which we'll look at in more detail. So social relations, what is Cohen trying to say? Ultimately, what Cohen came to the conclusion is that when you look at property as a social relations, actually it's not at all about the physical object, which is maybe a house or a pen or something like that. What it is the relationship between two parties, and that is what property is. That is what makes the physical object, which is the content that you're discussing, a property. It is a social relation which makes it a property. And I think he was onto something there, because if you, at the age of 2, you're fairly self-sufficient, you wake up on a desert island and it's only you've never known anybody else to come. This is a hypothetical scenario. There would be no need for property law or the concept of property, because you're living on a desert island which is yours. If there was even just one more person, then you would say that yes, there is need for property, because this is my area to do X, this is your area to do this. I will let you in at this time, and you can let out, but you have to stay out those times. And you start getting, more conditions applied. That's where property starts coming. So I think he was on to something, that it's not about the physical object, because the desert island land is a physical object. Property doesn't need to exist when that is there, if you're the only person. It is about social relationships. That's my understanding of it. But then he also goes on to talk about property and wealth. He says that economic value is not really necessary for something to be defined as a property. Especially if property is all about the social relations, it's not necessary for it to be, for the thing to have economic value. And, you can have, for example, you can have a ring from an ex-lover. It might have no economic value. It might be just a plastic ring, no value. But it's still, it still can be a property, and it still will, you know, he might want it back or whatever. There's social relations there about how that's going to work and who has the right to come use the ring, who doesn't, things like that. And you can have a value which doesn't have property. So you can, if you know an exercise that's really great, that's not exactly a property, but it is valuable, so it's a property-less value. And so he talks about this, that property and wealth, they're not always one, and they don't need to be one, because it all boils down to that property is a social relation. I don't particularly agree with this, because if it's not valuable, I don't think you need to have a property sort of relations study in it. If it's not valuable, I think the ring has some value of it, has an economic value to it. That is why, you know, it's defined as a property. And by economic value, as an economist, it's not always what is the cost, what is the value going to be when you resell it, or this, that. Economic value, you can put things like, you know, personal admiration for the object, and you can convert that into a monetary value. It's basically like utilitarianism. You can kind of find a way to make economic value like that. So I don't completely agree that property and wealth can be separated. And then he also makes a modification. He qualifies that, you know, the fact that your right to sell or use something is not something which is distinct of property, because property does not always provide you with the right to use your property or sell your property. You can think about leases. You can't sell them. Sometimes you own something which you can't use because it's in a trust or something like that. So he talks about that this characteristic, which at the time was there, it's not something that's important. And so again, you know, when you talk about your right to sell and things, and the whole reason why the right to sell, right to use is not intertwined with property, and it's not a distinctive feature, because again, property here you're looking at is a social relation. That is what it boils down to. And so what he's saying is, what is a social relation? Well, it is the right to exclude or include someone. That is basically what it is. If I, you know, the physical object is what it's about, but what is property? Property is saying that this physical relation is mine, and you have the right to be included in using it, or you have the right to be excluded. So that's what it comes up to. And property law also differs quite a bit from contract law, because we're not explicitly talking about two parties here. We're talking about one party and the rest of the world. It's your right, your social relationship to the rest of the world. So in talking about property is very much connected to the environment, because it's talking about, you know, when we look at carbon and I don't know, these environmental, the green movement, things like that. You're talking about your impact in the world and how do you fit in, and what is your right to consume and things like that. So they're very much intertwined. So now we've gone through like some of the key points that he brings up in his dialogue. So let's go back to then, how does he define private property rights, property law? How does he define this? He says, that is property to which the following label can be attached. To the world, keep off X unless you have my permission, which I may grant or withhold. Signed, private citizen, endorsed the state. Now, if you don't already know what that means, I'll put it in some other words. It's exclusions which individuals can withhold or impose with the state backing you up. So it's very important to have the state there, because it regulates all this and it endorses it and it makes sure this is happening. And it's also what gives you practically that right to say that this is my property and I can include you, I can exclude you. And that's basically what property comes down to. So I hope this is a good introduction into property, because I think what Cohen has to say has a lot to talk about the nature of property, and this will be important because when you look at land law, it boils down to, but wait, is it really about the house we're talking about, or is it really about the relationship between two parties? Now, there's some more implications of property law, which I want to talk about in part 2 of this video, which is going to be about Nicholas Bromley's 2003 article. I think it's called Law, Violence and Physical Geography. I'm not sure. I'll just check the name and I'll say in the next video. But thank you for watching.